Good day to all of you who are signing in from points all around the world. We're a global profession, and this is truly a global webinar on the IPPF Evolution Project. I'm Mike Peppers, Chairman of the IIA's International Internal Audit Standards Board, and we're so pleased to have a total of 4,414 registrants who have joined the two sessions that we're making this presentation. The first one was this morning. As we begin, here are some brief administrative items that I've been asked to share. If you experience any technical issues at any point, please start by trying to press the F5 key on your PC or the Command R on your Mac to refresh your console. That usually resolves most of the issues. It's also recommended that you close out any other programs or email to ensure you have maximum bandwidth to view the program. But if you continue to experience any challenges, please use the purple Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen to send us a message. Staff will work with you in the background to help resolve them. If you have any questions or comments related to the IPPF content of the presentation, those can be submitted using that same Q&A icon at any time. But because there are more than 4,400 of you, and we also have a very full hour of content to share, staff will be monitoring the most trending questions and try and summarize those for us to address at the end of the presentation. For any that we can't fully cover, we're planning to develop a kind of frequently asked questions document, and we'll post that to the special IPPF page of the IA's website that I'll tell you about a little bit later. Finally, this webinar does qualify for IIA CPE, but it's not NASBA CPE, so there won't be any polling questions that you have to answer. You do need to stay online for the entire period of time, and then you'll get an email within 20 days with your certificate. All right, then, let's get going with some quick introductions. Before my current service as chairman of the Standards Board, it was my honor in 2017-2018 to serve as chairman of the Global Board of Directors, and I had the opportunity to interact with colleagues like all of you around the world. By day, however, I'm the chief audit executive at the University of Texas System, and I'm a member of the Austin, Texas chapter. I'm joined today by Paul Sobel, himself a former chairman of the Global Board, also a former chairman of the Standards Board, and he's the current chairman of the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations, COSO. Paul's a member of the Atlanta, Georgia chapter. We were very fortunate to recruit Paul to assist us on this project, tapping his deep experience and insights. Although ours are the only two faces that you'll actually see today, there's so many others who've been a part of this journey that we're calling the IPPF Evolution. The Standards Board itself is comprised of 19 very strong members and practitioners from 13 countries, all so committed and passionate about our professional guidance. I'll talk more about these next groups in a moment, but I want to acknowledge and thank the team at Global Headquarters, led by Dr. Lily B., our President and CEO, Anthony Pugliese, who advocates for us on this project every chance he gets. Also, our IPPF Oversight Council, that's chaired by Ms. Alta Prinsloo from South Africa. And of course, the support of our Global Board of Directors has been tremendous and extremely helpful. Throughout our comments today, Paul and I will remind you more than once that this project is still very much in the works. It's in draft. The Standards Board is still actively in the process of developing, deliberating, and considering how to make this just an incredible new set of standards. So while it might be odd to call something confidential that we're sharing on the web with 4,400 people, the point is that if it were to be redistributed to others who don't have that context, it might cause some confusion when later versions are put out. So we would just ask that you treat this as confidential. The webinar will be recorded and archived for viewing for those who couldn't attend to one of the sessions today. Also, a PDF of these slides should be available to you now in the Resources tab that's here on this format. If you don't see it, please just refresh the page, and that should show it to you as well. So, to give you a bit of an overview of what Paul and I are going to cover today, we'll share about the goals that we've had that have been guiding us as we've been progressing through this task. You'll see how we're structuring the elements of the IPPF and the standards. And we'll introduce you to how we've organized them into 5 domains. To get your head a little bit in that ballpark now, you can see here that the first general domain we'll talk about is the purpose of internal auditing. The other 4 domains will capture ethics and professionalism, and then the real rubber meets the road kind of categories of governing, managing, and performing internal audit functions and services. We'll cover a concept that's still in the development stages that we're calling application standards. Then we'll talk about the plan for all of the work that will be ahead and get us across the finish line. So to do that, let's get into the project itself, the goals and the progress that we've made to date. This graphical depiction of the current IPPF is more than familiar to all of us. Its mission, 4 mandatory elements, and the volumes of implementation and supplemental guidance that were all thoughtfully and responsibly developed at the times they were introduced, and they've served our profession so well. But whenever we began to look at this, the Standards Board really believed, and the results of our research confirmed, that it needed some changes and some updates to best serve us now and into the future. You'll see here some of the things that we heard whenever we got that research done. We heard from you that you want us to simplify the structure of the IPPF, to make it easier to use and bring clarity and some alignment to the elements that you saw on that graphic. The standards, they need to be timely. They need to be updated whenever there are emerging topical areas that need to be considered. And of course, make them practical and help them communicate and help us to advocate as a profession. And so as we thought about those challenges and the things, kind of the problems that we needed to solve as we went through this, here's some of the goals that we kept in mind throughout the process. First of all, we want to structure the standards so that they help you and help our practitioners ensure conformance. We don't want to make it difficult to conform with the standards. It should be something that is a responsible and a strong internal audit department can do. And then as we do that, we know that'll drive quality, because it is possible to conform with the set of standards and still not deliver a quality product. So we want to make that easier to do, because when we deliver quality, that leads us into value. We're going to see that we really had a focus on being able to demonstrate our value to our stakeholders, management, and others who we interact with and who rely on us. And of course, when we do all that, we're going to gain credibility. We're going to have other entities that are outside of us recognize that and actually drive adoption of our standards with other bodies. Because we want that recognition. We want those individuals to be calling on and looking to internal auditors to do those services for them. So this is the progress. This is the road that we've been traveling. It's a high-level depiction, and I'll cover the first 3 stages actually in more detail in some coming slides. But you can see that really what we started off even earlier than 2020 was starting to research, starting to get background to this, as you'll see some of the efforts that we've made to really identify the things that are important and that need to be addressed, and then how we can best do it. Because even though we have 19 great members of the Standards Board, we need a lot of input from that. So we've been working on that and still are. We also knew that we wanted a new structure to the standards. We talked about clarity and simplicity, and so we've had that as a goal, and we completed that structure back in last year, and we'll be talking and walking you through that today as well. And then, of course, there were some important things around our governance and due process that were important for us to consider in the ways in which we deliver and develop our standards. And so we got some of that clarified working with our Oversight Council and the Global Board of Directors. And now where we're at is we're in that stage 4. We're in content development. We're pretty far down the road there in some of those areas, which we'll share with you, but it is still being developed. The Standards Board is still, as I said, actively considering and debating and a lot of the ways in which we're going to present information. And actually, we are still gathering input and seeking input from folks in a variety of ways. And that's part of that stakeholder engagement. You see, we kind of put that there because the stakeholder engagement really covers 4, 5, 6, and 7, really. We want to ensure that we're hearing from people that are outside the IAA, outside the Standards Board, outside our organization, so that we're responsive to their needs. You'll see then after we develop the content, we go into public exposure. And if you've never been a part of that process, or it's been many years since we had a very big public exposure, that's where we send out the proposed drafts of the standards, and we ask for public comment. Not just you, the members, but a lot of others, that anyone can comment on that, and they do. And so that's a period you'll see that actually it's out for 90 days when they have that public exposure, and we'll talk to you about when that's going to be coming up. But then we get back that feedback, and we thoughtfully, seriously consider that, and that's in the review process, and then ultimately we get to issuance of our standards. So let's dive a little bit into some of the things so that you'll be aware of how we've been doing research. We sought input from your affiliate representatives around the world in many different formats. You see some of those that are identified there on the left through global assemblies and surveys and roundtables that we did where we asked people to participate. We had many individuals who did that. We also did a global practitioner survey in 2021, and we had over 3,600 responses to it, a tremendous response that gave us some feedback. And we've been working with others, and you can even see quality assessors because as we think about this and as we think about how this will impact our quality assessment reviews in the future, we certainly wanted to have that in mind as we go through it. I talked about the standard setting governance and the due process that we looked at. We were also tasked with revisiting that to make certain that it was accountable and transparent. And a lot of folks are not even aware, actually, that there is an entity called the IPPF Oversight Council. And you can see there that they do just that. They have oversight and monitor. They even attended our meetings that we had recently to observe, and they look at the output that we're doing to ensure that we're adhering with good, responsible governance processes. The Oversight Council is made up of representatives and appointees from 5 different entities: INTOSAI, IFAC, OECD, the World Bank, and NACD. And then it also has 2 IIA appointees that are on it. Of course, then they report to the Global Board there on the left, and the Global Board has been tremendously supportive of this process in providing resources and support and engagement. And that also includes, in that area, the headquarters, the great, strong team that is there and it's been part of developing this, both in the standards and in the guidance areas. And then keeping all of that in mind, as I mentioned, the stakeholder engagement, we've structured some very specific ways that we can go out and get feedback. And in fact, we have 2 very structured programs coming up, one in next month in September in Washington, D.C., and then the other in October in Brussels, Belgium, where we'll be bringing in individuals to talk with us and tell us, to look at some of the same things we're going to be sharing with you today and give us some feedback on how those standards are in place. Because really, all of this helps us to set the standards in the public interest. And that Oversight Council developed and issued a paper in March of this year that outlined that, some strong elements of how standards should be set in the public interest. And I would recommend that to you for reading if you're interested in understanding and learning a bit more about how our governance process works. So, how is all this going to be laid out? Well, let's talk for a moment about the structure of the new standards. You'll recall that one of the things I told you is that our research indicated that we needed to simplify that structure and get better alignment. So we've taken, as you see on the left, our current six elements of our IPPF that are above that black line on the left, and those are all going to simply be organized as standards. Paul and I will walk through that moment in more detail. But generally, the IPPF itself won't have a separate mission, definition, or even a code of ethics. Those concepts will all still be there, but they'll be in standards. And when we look at the right, above the black line, you'll see that those standards will now pull up some of the areas that's currently in our implementation guidance. What we heard from you also is that you desire to, in that simplification, the ability to go in and see all the relevant points that you're researching in one place, not have to go to multiple guidance sources to pull it up. Within those restructured standards on the right side, that's the content development that we're working on right now. On the next slide, I'll cover a little bit more of the difference between what we call general and application standards. The content of those general standards is what we're focusing on right now, moving through the vetting process in the remaining months of this calendar year. The content of those potential application standards is also being worked on, but that completion will follow after the general standards. The last point to remember to mention here on this slide relates to other guidance. That'll be developed and vetted outside the standards board, but we'll have a role in that review and ensuring that it has consistency with the standards and that it's cohesive and usable for others, but in a more guidance, not a mandatory type of a way. So a little bit more now on the two types of standards that I mentioned, and we will be covering these in further detail too. But as we look at the distinctions of the standards, think of the general standards as those things that are the timeless elements of what we do, those unequivocal must-dos that apply to all of us in every situation. They applied to us 20 years ago when the last issue was done, and probably 20 years from now, those of us that are, or I should say those of you that are perhaps still in the profession 20 years from now, will still be considering those, and they'll be universally applicable to everyone. But there are some circumstances or engagements that don't rise to that same level of universality or required treatment. Paul will give some examples of those kinds of things that we're talking now and how they would include the requirement that you consider them and either perform them or indicate why you didn't perform them. But these will be more specific in nature and in content than the general standards. So now, here's a graphical depiction of what I referred to earlier as the 5 domains. And we've mapped all of the principles that we've currently identified and all of the standards into these 5 domains. The first one and the second one are actually somewhat overarching or kind of all-encompassing because they really apply across the board. The purpose of internal auditing, we'll cover that. It really is in and of itself, and there aren't any standards in that particular statement. But domain 1 is the purpose. Domain 2 is now ethics and professionalism. You see those concepts on the left: integrity, objectivity, competence. We've added due professional care in here now, and confidentiality. All things that professionals need to do every day, as do all of those involved in our governance and even managing. So, but those are where some of those concepts are pulled into. And domains 1 and 2 are, as I said, overarching, but we'll actually today be covering a little bit more specificity around domains 3, 4, and 5. Those are the areas, as I said, where they really get into how we do, how the functions are carried out, how they're governed, and some important concepts there and principles that we'll look at. and then managing the function and performing. We really want people, whatever their specific role is, to be able to go to one domain and see generally the things that are applicable to them. So whenever you're communicating with your governing bodies, you'll have one domain that you can easily see and share with them and talk through. Those responsible for managing the internal audit function will see all of those principles and standards in one place. And then for the teams and the staff that are doing specific engagement things, this is where they'll find that in the fifth domain. So let's get into how some of these standards or changes are going to look as we do that. So to do that is we want to talk about the first domain that I referenced a moment ago was the purpose of internal auditing. Rather than have both a mission and a definition, the Standards Board thought it was more impactful and clear to have a statement of our purpose. Why are we here? And you'll see that we've taken a bold and strong alignment of that purpose with the success of our organizations. After all, our boards and our management, those are the ones who have to truly see and believe that we're helping them by what we do. Now, the next slide's actually going to have a fair number of words on it, but the top level is really just two brief sentences that are intended to capture that elevator speech statement. If you just have 30 seconds or so to tell someone why internal auditors exist and what that purpose is. Some bullets that you'll see below it really help us to identify in one place some of the key elements of that purpose. So here we've identified that the purpose of internal auditing is to enhance the value of an organization and to strengthen the organization's credibility with its stakeholders. Internal auditors achieve this purpose by providing objective assurance, insight, and advice. You know, just recently, unsolicited, my chancellor of the UT system and our CEO basically was at our audit committee, and he really wasn't even aware of this project and what we were doing looking at purpose. But he made the statement to our audit committee. He quoted a former president of the UT institution, where he said that public confidence is the only real endowment of a state university. Public confidence. He went on to say that the work of our internal audit function that we did for the UT system bolstered that credibility and that public confidence, and he found that invaluable as a CEO. So that really resonated with me, that the purpose we have to tie in with our success of our organizations. So now I'm going to invite Paul to join us and actually continue to talk through some more elements of this purpose. So welcome, Paul.
Thank you very much, Mike, and truly a pleasure to be here assisting you on this webinar. So as Mike indicated, the purpose itself, those first two sentences, is that's really intended to kind of be the overall description. You can think of it as your elevator speech. You use that kind of way of thinking about it. And that is that if somebody asks you, what is internal auditing? Why is internal auditing here? You should be able to talk about those two sentences. They should trickle off the tongue of internal auditors around the world. The first sentence really has two key points about enhancing value and strengthening credibility. And those are two very bold statements, as Mike alluded to. The second part talks a little bit about, well, how do internal auditors achieve this? And we do it through objective assurance, insight, and advice. Those are concepts that we've had embedded before in the mission, definition, and standards, but we really bring them to the forefront here. Now, in the event you're in an elevator longer than just a floor or two, you may get follow-up questions. Well, how does internal auditing do that, and what makes internal auditing unique? Isn't any activity in an organization focused on enhancing value and strengthening credibility? So on the left side, we talk about some of the specific things that internal auditing can do. Strengthening effective governance, risk management, and control, part of our current standards, but perhaps not prominent enough. Responsible decision-making and oversight. Frankly, successful organizations have better decision making, and internal audit can help strengthen that. Sustainable value creation and protection really comes out of the current mission, which talks about enhancing and preserving organizational value. And then finally, accountable stewardship of assets and reputation gets beyond the maybe traditional thing of internal audit, focusing on financial reporting and controls, to the broader perspective that we really can help with the accountable stewardship of all assets of an organization, one of the most important of which is the reputation. Now, on the right side, we talk about internal auditing being most effective when three conditions are in place. The first one is conforming with the standards. That should be a given, and that's clearly a focus on the current evolution of the standards. But the other two parts are truly what makes internal auditing unique, is our independent positioning and objective perspective, our objective oversight, our objective mindset. Those are things that have long been a landmark of internal auditing and perhaps not fully understood. I really believe that these are the things that will help you in that elevator conversation, or whatever conversation you're in, about trying to distinguish what's unique about internal audit from other activities within the organization. Now, I will mention that this is going to be a part of the exposure draft that Mike alluded to, and he will talk about that a little further later in terms of the timing and the process. This has gone through the global board of directors. They've agreed with this to have it exposed. That doesn't mean it's final. Everybody on the call and really everybody throughout the world will have an opportunity to provide their insights on the wording here and the concepts herein when we get to that exposure process. But we really believe this purpose sets a very high bar for internal auditing, something that is very important as we get into some of the other domains in the standards, where we talk about how important it is for that particular domain or particular principles to achieve the purpose that's laid out here. So with that in mind, I'm going to turn it back over to Mike to tee up our discussion on the remaining domains.
Thank you. So the purpose is domain one, but as I said, and as you saw, it doesn't include any standards. It's informational and helps us to communicate and advocate. So now let's look at how the standards are organized in domains 2 through 5. You'll see the same domains that I showed you graphically a few slides back. We've now articulated currently 15 principles. You know, we have 10 now in the IPPF, but we've identified 15 that have been mapped and positioned within those 4 domains. In our current content development activities, we're now directly mapping and organizing the standards under the principles as well, so that there will be a clear alignment. I mentioned earlier that domains 1 and 2 are unique because they're kind of overarching, and domain 2 is where we'll put the ethics and professionalism, what we now currently have as a code of ethics. We've also added due professional care here. It's obviously a critical domain, and a lot of great support and guidance will be there for us as professionals. You'll see the other areas, though, in governing. We're looking at how we get authorized, how we're positioned independently, and what does it mean to be overseen by a board. This, as I said earlier, will be some things that you can utilize as you discuss and have structuring your charters and other activities to ensure that you're engaged in the ways in which you and management agree. And then you see the principles that in managing, we'll talk about how leaders in the internal audit function strategically plan, how they address resource issues, and what responsibilities they have for communicating and ensuring performance and good quality work. And then the principles around performing, how do we do those engagements effectively? How do we conduct the work that we're doing and carry it out, and then communicate based on those specific projects engagements. So to dive a little further into each of those principles, I'm now going to ask Paul to talk through that for us at the next level.
Well, thanks again, Mike. So Just from a format standpoint, this is what you'll see when you dive into the new standards. First of all, Mike mentioned there are 15 principles. So for each of the principles, there are a collection of standards supporting those principles. Now, those standards, just as they are today, have certain requirements, the must statements that to really demonstrate conformance, to really demonstrate quality, internal audit functions must do these sort of things. Now, looking back to what Mike mentioned earlier about the importance of simplifying and aligning the standards, within each standard, we will also have recommended practices and ways of demonstrating conformance. Most of this comes from the implementation guides, which currently you have to go to a separate document to look at, but now they'll all be in one place. Some of these recommended practices may include certain elements of interpretations and other leading practices that we've come up with in concert with the Standards Board that I think will make it much easier for people to understand not just what are the requirements, but what are the ways that I can most effectively demonstrate those requirements and therefore demonstrate my conformance with the standards. So this structure, I think, is, again, much more streamlined and will better meet the needs of the organization as a whole and all internal auditors around the world. So let's dive into some of the individual domains. Mike had touched briefly on domain 2, which is really more about the internal auditors. It applies to all internal auditors. These 3 domains that I'll talk about focus a little bit more on really how do you operate within an internal audit function. The first one focuses on governing. Now, governing you may think of as a concept that is primarily organization related. If you look back to the definition in our current standards of governance, it says the combination of processes and structures implemented by the board to inform, direct, and manage and monitor the organization's activities. So this applies at the organization level, but it also applies to individual activities within the organization, including internal audit. So we thought it was very important to start the standards, this part of the standards, which how is the internal audit function governed? Now, what we do to begin this is we link it back to the purpose. The premise is that every organization will want to really fulfill that purpose, achieve that purpose. And to do that, that has really endowed certain requirements on the board. And that's what the focus of the governing domain is that there are requirements of the board in order for internal audit to fulfill its ultimate purpose within the organization. Mike touched on briefly the 3 principles to authorize, position independently, and oversee. And getting in those little bits, so authorization is where the board provides internal audit with a mandate. This is what we want and need internal audit to do. It also supports internal audit in all respects with scope, et cetera, to make sure that internal audit can fulfill that mandate. And then finally talks about how it has to approve the charter where that mandate is documented. There's other things documented as well in the charter. But this is, again, very much focused on the board authorizing the internal audit function and its future direction. Now, the second one on position independently is one we're all very familiar with, and that focuses on positioning internal audit independently within the organization, which is a very, very critical aspect of what makes internal auditing unique. It does touch on some of those unique roles that internal auditors, and specifically the chief audit executive, may have, the current standard number 1112, and what do you do in those cases? And then also touches on safeguards to independence, because there's a variety of circumstances that can arise that may run the risk of impairing independence. So what are the safeguards that the organization can put into place that the board needs to oversee and make sure are there? And then finally, there's an oversight role. Everything the board does really revolves around oversight. So the standards here focus on the natural and important interactions between the chief audit executive and the board, the support for the resources that are needed for the chief audit executive to fulfill that mandate. And we'll talk more about that when we get into managing. And then we get into the 1300 series, the quality assurance and improvement program, and ultimately the external assessment. Now, this falls more heavily into the managing domain, but it has to be set up here. This is where the board is saying that in order for us to provide the oversight that we need to understand what the CAE and the internal audit function is doing to ensure quality. So those 1300 series standards get teed up here. Then we move into the managing the internal audit function domain. This is heavily focused on the chief audit executive and whoever else has important management responsibility. And we start this with strategically planning. This is, when you think about it, every aspect of an organization really needs a strategic plan. So the portions of the standards here focus on the strategy for internal audit. That's a little longer range term looking at it. And then documenting it in the internal audit charter, certainly the mandate needs to be there from the governing domain, but also the strategy. Developing an internal audit plan, which of course includes then evaluating and improving governance, risk management, and the control processes. And then coordinating and placing reliance on other assurance activities, which naturally happen in many organizations. Now, the managing resources, I said in the governing domain, it's important for the board to provide kind of the mandate around resources. Well, now it's the CAE's responsibility to manage resources in these 4 areas. First, financial resources. That's the budget. Of course, that's the thing we all think about on an ongoing basis. Secondly, the human resources. That's the people. The people who are actually doing the work. That's attracting, developing, and retaining good internal auditors. The technological resources. In today's world, technology is everywhere, and that includes an internal audit. So it's understanding how technology can enable the internal audit process, where it should be used, and making sure people have the right training to use it. And then finally, methodologies. That we kind of define as the policies, processes, and procedures to guide the internal audit function and what it does day to day and week to week. Communicating effectively is outside the engagement, it's broader. So this involves what sort of communications, in addition to what was covered in the governing domain, need to happen with the board on an ongoing basis, what other communications at other parts of the organization are necessary, what communications may be necessary or appropriate with other stakeholders besides those within the organization. And then it covers some unique aspects of specific communications that are covered in the current standards. Then finally, the enhances performance principle gets into a little more detail of what I talked about in the governing domain, and that is setting up an internal assessment process as a part of the quality assurance and improvement program, and then also going beyond just conformance with the standards to make sure that you can effectively measure performance. And we consider performance to be a level above conformance. This is where you're making sure that you're really adding the value and delivering the quality expected within the organization. Then finally, performing internal audit services. This is the part that I think is still widely understood. We do have some new standards or some new iterations of the standards in this area, but a lot of this is what you're used to. So it starts with planning the engagement. You have an informal engagement plan, do your preliminary communications with the engagement people involved with the audit or area under review, going through a risk assessment, setting objectives and scope for the engagement, and then ultimately developing the work program. Again, all things that are, I think, well documented in today's standards, but the recommended practices, I think, will enhance people's understanding of this area. Then you get into conducting the engagement. So, of course, this starts with gathering the necessary information, testing that information, which is a series of analyses, and ultimately coming out with results. And then determining, based on those results, what your conclusions are on individual results or audit findings, what recommendations you may have, and then documenting that as well. And then finally, you have to communicate and monitor progress. So that's around both the interim and final communications. There will be a series of communications throughout engagements, often and particularly in bigger engagements, but virtually every engagement is going to have some sort of final communication. And this will give you the requirements around those final communications. Talks a little bit about communication quality, and then making sure that those communications are accurate, reliable, timely, concise, et cetera, et cetera. And then finally, monitoring progress. If we just deliver an audit report and go away, we don't have any idea whether those very valuable audit findings and observations have been implemented or not. So monitoring progress is really the follow-up approach to make sure that those recommendations have in fact been implemented and that the organization is ultimately achieving the benefits from the internal audits. So hopefully that gives you an idea. There's an awful lot that goes into this. I guess I'll give some call outs and kudos. We've got a small team of us that have been working diligently on it. Christine Hovius, Larissa Nelson from the IIA, and then Erton Anderson, who's like me, an outsider, a past chair of the standards board. We've been working very hard on trying to develop these standards and get them into a position where we think they will truly meet the objectives of this overall project. So with that in mind, I'm going to turn it back over to Mike, and he's going to tee up the application standards.
Thank you, Paul. Yes, and let me add my thanks to that team as well. And those have been addressing the general standards that we talked about. But we also have this concept now that we're considering about how to address other standards. And you'll remember, I'll take us back to some of the vision that we had was around the fact that parts of our standards do need to be timeless and carry on, but we also need timely guidance and standards and relevance. And so the concept of looking at some of these important topics is where we're envisioning application standards. The purpose is to make sure that we've got consistency, that we've got quality when the internal audit groups are performing specific activities that are, you'll see some examples in a moment that are some perhaps more emerging topics and things that come up, and that we need to be sure that we are able to address so that we can have relevance to our management. So that, the timeless ones are sitting there, and those are kind of the crown jewels, but what are the things that we're able to do? How do we guide ourselves and make certain that we have consistent quality and standards in these new things that come up? So to do that, we've proposed a new standards architecture that has both general standards and application standards. And so, Paul, I'll let you pick that up and talk about some of the examples here.
Okay, thanks again, Mike. Yeah, the general standards, of course, we've just talked about quite a bit. Those are similar to what we've had in the past. They're requirements, the must-dos. Mike mentioned the 15 principles. I kind of touched briefly on those as well. And it really applies to the core things that every internal audit function is expected to do. Now, what the application standards do is it kind of broadens our definition of standards. The past few decades, we've looked at standards as the must. These are the requirements. The application standards is something that I think touches more on what some other professions do, and that recognize that they may not apply to every audit function in every circumstance, but there are some unique considerations that are very important and will help move the profession forward. So really what we consider these to be, as you can see on the slide, is they're very complementary to the general standards. They really are intended to provide additional context and clarification on how you apply the general standards in unique circumstances. We indicate typically topic or sector, and I'll give you examples of those on the next slide. But kind of going back to that first point there, required considerations, that almost sounds like an oxymoron, but really what we're trying to get to here is if we want the profession to move forward and be able to handle some of these unique areas that are growing in consideration and growing in prominence, we need to make sure that every audit function is at least considering the nature of the governance and risk and control considerations for those particular topics. We kind of envision this as probably an apply or explain, so we recognize that it may not make sense for all internal audit functions, but if not, there should be a requirement to explain why not. Now, this is something that is still being, I would say, actively debated within the Standards Board. That's why Mike alluded to earlier that these are potential application standards. We're not sure exactly where they'll fall within the application structure. We're not sure exactly what it will mean from a quality assurance standpoint, but we feel strongly that what's included in these application standards are very important considerations that will really help the internal audit profession as a whole be better prepared to address some key risk and topical areas. So what you see on this slide is, I think, really evidence of that. Now, again, the left side, you saw that graphic before. Those are the general standards. And the right side are the application standards that we're currently considering. This is, as indicated, initial draft list. But these are areas that are kind of common sense. When you look at the first few, cybersecurity, ES&G, third-party management, those apply to really any organization throughout the world. They tend to be high-risk areas, and so therefore, if an internal audit function is going to do audits in those areas, they really need more help in understanding how do we apply the general standards to these specific topics. That's what the application standards will help do. You know, some of the other ones, maybe some more IT focus things, information technology governance, using data and technology to perform internal audit services, and even assessing organizational governance, which is a part of the current standards, 2110, that will be embedded in the updated standards. How do you do that? How does an internal audit function and a chief audit executive really assess the effectiveness of organizational governance? We think these application standards will provide the information and requirements to do a much better job at that. Of course, fraud risk and privacy risk are two other very prominent areas that affect for every organization. Then we get into maybe things that are, I'll call them sector specific, standards, conformance, and small internal audit functions. I've already seen one or two questions in the Q&A about, well, how does this relate to a smaller internal audit function? And that's what we intend to provide, that all of this is the universal standards, the general standards are intended to apply to public sector, private sector, large organizations, small organizations, for-profit, not-for-profit, but it may require some additional explanation and interpretation. That's what this application standard can do, since there are a large percentage of internal audit functions around the globe that are considered small. And then we actually are working on some specific ones relating to the public sector. Public sector can vary from country to country, but public sector has some unique attributes to it. We think it's very important to make sure that internal audit functions understand how to apply these general standards if you're working in the public sector. So again, to be determined where this goes, but I think this could be a very, very significant step forward for our profession to have these kind of application standards. So Mike, I'll let you kind of bring us home with where do we go from here?
Absolutely. Well, I hope it's evident and you can see that there's been a tremendous amount that's been done already. But here's where we're going to do the last elements that are going to get us ultimately to that goal of issuing. So I talked a little bit earlier about the public exposure process. It's very important that we do that for the reasons that I described earlier. And to get there, we are going to be working over the next several months of this calendar year to finalize the standards, the general standards, and get those drafted. And as we do that, they'll also be in the process of starting translation, because to get them out and to get global input, we of course recognize that we need to have translation. So that will also begin in the last quarter of this year. So then what we would anticipate is that you would see the public exposure starting sometime in the first quarter of next year, 2023. And when that happens, we want to call on all of you to give us feedback, but also your groups that you're affiliated with around the world, as well as the stakeholders that we talked about earlier. Encourage them to look at it, explain what our standards are. It's a wonderful thing to say that we have global standards. We're a global profession. That whenever I talk with my board members and leaders, sometimes they're not even aware of that. So use this as an advocacy tool as well. But you'll see there that the general standards are processed, and historically, we've always allowed 90 days for that to occur. So that would go out. depending on how we come out with application standards and exactly what those are, I told you that one of the goals is to be timely and quicker to market, quicker to the membership with some of the with those standards. So we may look at ways that we could streamline that a bit, because that really does slow things down in terms of being able to get final guidance out. So, but generally right now we would get those out. They would be available for public comment. Then that would put us at the standards being released at sometime either in late 2023 with an effective date some point in 2024. One of the things that everyone always asks is, well, how is that going to impact the timing of other elements of our quality assessment reviews, our certification exams, a whole host of things? Well, all of those would then, whatever dates that we do have final effective standards, typically we look at that next year afterward. And so really for the purposes of those of you that are considering taking some of our certification exams, which I hope you are, please go ahead, do that now. Don't delay, because it will be several years really before some of those changes begin to occur. And then also, the same thing is true of quality assessment reviews. We'll have an effective date of the standards, but then in years after that, quality assessors will determine which set or which IPPF that work was done under. So we can't give specific dates at this point. It will really, a lot of that will depend on when we finally do go out. So the ways in which we're going to continue to keep you updated are through the website, and we have a specific portal in the website. Maybe some of you have utilized that to register or become aware of this event today. And so we'll keep that updated. We'll have some things there. Feel free to go and look at it as frequently as you might like. But there will also be some times when we push out some notifications and we make people aware that that something new has been posted there. And so we'll definitely want to encourage you to utilize that resource in terms of our communication. So with that, that brings us to the end of our prepared comments and the things that we wanted to cover. So we have a few minutes, and as I mentioned, we will not in any way be able to get to all of the questions. We'll try and cover a few high-level ones, but on that website that I just showed you, we will have a document that we'll work on in the next couple of weeks that pulls together some of the most common and frequently asked questions so that you can go back and perhaps have those answers. So with that, let me see if we have some general things. And Paul, have you been able to assess some of the things that we need to address here?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. One, a little bit more general. Can you share this presentation with members of your team? Absolutely. I mean, we encourage that. We understand and respect the kind of the confidential, draft aspects of it, as well as Mike indicated earlier. But this is all about communicating and in advance of the exposure. So happy to let you do that. Another question I'd like to handle, specifically since it's from somebody I know pretty well. Will the application standards be primarily aligned with the fifth domain, or will they apply to all domains? So it kind of depends. So the first several that were listed there, the more specific topical ones, cybersecurity, ESG, et cetera, yes, those will probably be primarily focused on the fifth domain, on performing internal audits. But some of the other ones, when you get into the more sector or the small internal audit, et cetera, those will really apply across most, if not all, of the domains. So again, a very good question. It will really depend. And as I mentioned, the focus of these application standards is to try and help increase conformance more broadly by helping internal auditors understand how to apply those general standards in a wide variety of areas.
Right, Paul.
Mike, anything you want to?
Well, I was going to say, and it's really not an either-or situation. In situations where application standards do apply and you're implementing, the general standards still are in play. And so you still would conform with general standards, even though you may be looking at a topical application standard. So they'll really, work in concert and complementary with each other.
I see a question on, do you anticipate the updated standards will continue to require an external quality assessment every 5 years? Right now, that's our thinking. Again, this is certainly subject to final deliberation by the Standards Board and, of course, the exposure process. We do believe that there's a lot of value in having an external quality assessment. Granted that in some circumstances can be achieved through a self-assessment and independent validation. But we also believe that there may be certain circumstances where 5 years is too long a period of time. If you are in a higher risk industry, maybe heavily regulated, large company, great stakeholder expectations, it may make sense to do it more frequently. So again, we will see. Again, these are still draft considerations, but right now we're sticking with the every 5 years, but hope to have guidance on when it might be appropriate more frequently.
Right. Yes, I think that concept is one that has quite a bit of interest, both in this one as well as the session this morning. And we talk about in that quality assessment, it is important that the purpose of that in the spirit of quality assessment is that we as internal auditors are as accountable for the things that we do as we look to and assess our clients and our auditees in our management areas and in our organizations. So really the goal there, and it was, as you saw, it was actually the first goal that I mentioned. The structure of the new standards is really intended to help to make that conformance even more achievable, not easier, because if things are necessarily easy, that does not indicate always a quality work, but more manageable to be able to implement and to conform and to demonstrate conformance as just a natural part of what we do. Well, those are a couple of high-level things. As I said, we're not going to be able to get to everyone. Please continue if you have any last-minute questions, put them in. We've already, even since the session about 12 hours ago, 10 hours ago this morning, staff is already accumulating and capturing those questions so that we can give you some feedback. And so, as I indicated, we'll do that on the web portal. But in the last couple of minutes, let me wind down and close us out by, first of all, thanking again Paul for participating today, not just today, but also in this project. We're, as I said, very happy to have him here. I mentioned those folks earlier who have been such an important process, and now, by extension, all of you are part of this process, and you're now some of the 4,400 or so people that within the last 24 hours have become much more educated and aware of what we're doing. And so we call on you, we solicit your input, we sincerely want it. And the Standards Board is just a tremendous group of people. I add my thanks to them. And on behalf of the Standards Board, let me thank you for your interest in our profession, for your commitment, for the things that each of you does every day. These are challenging jobs, but they are enjoyable. That's why I'm a career internal auditor, because I just so much enjoy what I do. And I hope that's true of you. And I hope that the new IPPF and the structure and the standards we put together will make that even more meaningful, helpful to you and to our profession going forward. So with that, let me thank you. Let me thank our technical team for coordinating with us today. Wish you the best of the rest of your day or evening where you are, and we look forward to talking again. Thank you.